It was a morning like any other in the village of East Gossington, damp, quietly alive, and wholly uninterested in the dramas of the outside world. Elderly men smoked pipes by the butcher's window, nodding solemnly as women in well-pressed tweeds passed them with baskets of eggs and gossip. A gentle breeze rustled the hedgerows, and from the neat garden at Fern Dell, the home of the late Colonel Harbottle, came the familiar clink of teacups and the murmuring of women's voices. Fern Dell was now occupied by his niece, Miss Juliet Harbottle, a woman who had inherited not only the old house but the Colonel's lofty sense of duty, along with a rather cooler appreciation for her neighbours than her uncle had possessed. She was hosting what she called a spring chit-chat, essentially tea for the more decorous ladies of the village. The invitation, hand-delivered by her cook's shy daughter, had gone out only 2 days earlier, and included such polite luminaries as the vicar's wife, Miss Clementine Price, a devout collector of Victorian glove boxes, Mrs. Broadley, whose husband owned the garage and was believed to be seeing the widow Finch, and of course Miss Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead. "Such a pleasure to see you again, Miss Marple," Juliet said with measured warmth as she guided the elderly woman to a cushioned wicker chair. "I hope the roses at St. Mary Mead are faring better than mine. Black spot this year. Utterly ruthless." "Black spot," murmured Miss Marple, her eyes twinkling beneath the brim of her straw hat, "is like most social diseases, my dear. It thrives in conditions one might prefer not to examine too closely. The tea was Earl Grey, slightly oversteeped. The biscuits were lavender shortbread, slightly underdone, and yet all seemed as proper and uneventful as any village gathering should, until a sharp cry came from the garden path, followed by the frantic figure of Ada Finch, the widow from Crabapple Lane. "Fire!" she shouted, her grey hair dishevelled and cheeks flushed. "There's smoke at the vicarage. I saw it from the turn." The teacups rattled, gasps erupted, and chairs were hastily pushed back. The vicarage was barely 2 streets away. Everyone knew it, a stately ivy-draped home tucked behind St. Martin's Church, where Reverend Arnold Bream and his timid wife, Hester, lived quietly and devoutly. "Dear Lord," whispered Mrs. Broadley. "Do you suppose it's—" But Miss Marple was already on her feet, collecting her gloves. "It would be prudent," she said gently, "to be sure whether it is a fire, or something pretending to be one." They arrived to find not flames, but confusion. The smoke was faint, clinging to the air like a memory rather than a danger. It curled from the side parlour window, yet there was no crackling, no orange glow, no sound of destruction, only the vicar's voice, loud and strained as he ushered out Hester, coughing and clutching a handkerchief. "It's out," Reverend Bream insisted. "Just some old linen, badly stored near the fireplace. A smouldering ember must have caught, but it's nothing, truly nothing at all." Yet his hands trembled as he spoke, and Hester's face had a pallor that no mere fright could explain. "Was anyone else in the house?" Miss Marple asked gently, stepping forward with the unassuming grace of a woman long practiced in asking the right questions as if she had no idea they were being asked. The vicar hesitated, then lied. "No, only us." But the lingering scent, something like singed velvet, and the peculiar way Hester turned toward the staircase before forcing her gaze away, suggested otherwise. "I saw no smoke from the chimney," muttered Mrs. Broadley, frowning. "Isn't that odd?" Miss Marple did not reply. She was watching Hester, who now gripped the hem of her sleeve as though anchoring herself to something unseen. Her husband continued his explanations, all rational, all plausible, all just slightly too rehearsed. Then the constable arrived, summoned by an alarmed grocer who'd spotted the smoke from his bicycle, and with him the whispering began in earnest. Later that evening, as the village settled into its habitual unease, that peculiar strain that always followed something strange and unsettling even when told not to worry, Miss Marple returned to her drawing-room in St. Mary Mead, where the fire burned steadily and nothing smelled of smoke. She poured herself a small glass of Madeira and sat by the window, knitting a scarf for her niece's birthday. And yet her hands moved more slowly than usual, because something didn't sit right. Fires, after all, had a temperament. They did not smolder politely in corner rooms and vanish before making their presence known. They did not start without fuel, and they did not, most certainly not, vanish without smoke. Unless, of course, someone had wanted to start a fire just long enough to cover something up. And so, Miss Marple made a mental note. Not about the fire, but about the lie. It was never the smoke that mattered. It was who claimed to have seen it, and who pretended not to. Miss Marple sat quite still in her drawing-room, the soft clack of knitting needles giving rhythm to the low hiss of the fire. Outside, East Gossington had long since settled into the quiet of evening, with only the occasional gust of wind fluttering through the hedgerows. But within the walls of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple's mind moved briskly, tracing the smoke that had not risen and the fire that had not burned. The next morning dawned brisk and clear, the sun giving the illusion of warmth that the air stubbornly refused. Miss Marple, already dressed in dove grey with her second-best brooch pinned modestly, stepped out for her usual walk to the greengrocer's. But today's route took a curious detour down the lane that curved discreetly past the vicarage. The Bream's house looked placid enough. There were no broken windows, no charred shutters, no evidence of emergency beyond a faint black smear around the side parlour's window frame. That, and the way the curtains inside had been drawn too tightly, as if to keep out eyes more than sunlight. Miss Marple's gaze lingered a moment. Then she continued down the lane and around the corner to the village green, where Mr. Prescott, the grocer, was tidying up his produce bins. "Good morning, Mr. Prescott," she said cheerily. "Miss Marple?" "Fine morning, though I suppose fire's got us all a bit rattled, eh?" "Quite so," she replied, selecting a handful of carrots. "I do hope the vicar and his wife are none the worse." "Well now, that's just the thing," Mr. Prescott said, lowering his voice. "It wasn't half strange, that business yesterday. I saw the smoke clear as anything while cycling back from delivering to the Hatchers, but when I arrived, there wasn't so much as a flicker. Bit of scorched fabric and a pail of water, that's all." "I understand it was linen," said Miss Marple, as though commenting on the weather. "That's what they said. But I've known linen to smoulder, yes, not stink like whatever that was. Reminded me of when old Mrs. Platt tried to burn her husband's Sunday jacket after he passed." "Wool blend. Smoked something awful," Miss Marple gave a sympathetic nod. "Poor Mrs. Platt. I suppose grief does make us act strangely," Prescott grunted. Grief didn't cover up the fact she'd never liked the smell of pipe tobacco. Funny thing, though. Saw young Margaret Finch running from the vicarage not half an hour before the smoke started. That made Miss Marple pause. "The baker's girl?" "That's her." Bit of a jumpy thing, always biting her nails. "Said she'd gone to deliver hymnals for the choir, Mrs. Bream's request, apparently. But she looked white as a sheet." Miss Marple thanked him and continued on her way, mind quietly assembling the pieces. Margaret Finch. A burned item that left no chimney smoke, a lie from the vicar, and a young woman running away, unnoticed until now. Later that day, Miss Marple took tea with her old friend Mrs. Lavinia Redgrave, who, despite being mostly deaf in one ear, possessed an astonishing talent for knowing everyone's private business. She also happened to be the head of the village's church flower committee and a close acquaintance of Hester Bream. "They haven't said much to anyone, of course," Lavinia said as she spooned jam onto a scone. "Very hush-hush, but Hester's been ever so peculiar since yesterday. Eyes all puffy. Said it was from the smoke, but between you and me, I think she's been crying." "Poor Hester," Miss Marple murmured. "And the vicar snapped at Mr. Gudgeon this morning. The man only asked whether the evening service would go ahead. Said something about the sanctity of peace being a difficult thing to maintain. Imagine? Arnold was never one for dramatics. Miss Marple let the silence settle before she said, "Tell me, dear, was Margaret Finch still singing in the youth choir?" Lavinia looked up sharply. "No, funny you mention it. She stopped attending about 3 weeks ago. Rumor had it she'd had a, difference with someone. Someone in the church." Lavinia gave a furtive glance at the window. "Don't repeat this, Jane, but there were whispers." About her and the vicar, Miss Marple gently placed her teacup down. "Whispers, dear?" She lingered after services. Took to writing little notes for the hymn board. Nothing overtly wrong, mind you. But one evening, Mrs. Bream came out from evensong in tears, and Margaret was dismissed from choir duties the very next week. The older woman lowered her voice. Some said it was jealousy. Others thought it might have been something more, improper. Miss Marple sat back, eyes narrowing faintly. That would be unfortunate, especially if it created tension in the household. "I'll say," Lavinia muttered. "And now this fire. I don't like it, Jane. I don't like it one bit." That evening, as twilight draped the rooftops in soft violet, Miss Marple penned a note to Inspector Crayborn at the County Constabulary, requesting a short visit under the pretext of concern for church property. She didn't believe in involving the authorities before necessary, but neither did she ignore smoke without fire. The next day, she stopped by the bakery on High Street. Mrs. Finch, a pale and overworked woman, was kneading dough with anxious energy. "Is Margaret in?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Finch wiped her hands. "Upstairs. She's not been herself since yesterday. I thought the fresh air might help, but she's kept to her room." "Perhaps I might say hello?" Miss Marple said, already making her way to the narrow staircase. Margaret opened the door at once. She was a thin, wide-eyed girl of 17 with a nervous habit of pulling at her sleeve. Her eyes were swollen. She offered a weak smile when she saw Miss Marple. "Hello," she said. "Mum said you'd come." Miss Marple sat on the edge of the bed, her voice soft. "I wanted to see if you were well." Margaret looked away. "It's just what happened yesterday. It scared me. Did you see what caused the smoke?" Margaret hesitated. "I wasn't there then. I just left. Mrs. Bream asked me to drop off the hymnals, and I did. She was in the parlor, but something felt wrong. She looked frightened, and then the vicar came in and told me to leave." "Did he raise his voice?" "No, but his eyes. He was angry. Not shouting angry. Quiet angry." "And did you notice what was burning?" Margaret shook her head quickly. "No, I don't think the fire had started yet, but I heard a sound, like something tearing and someone crying." Miss Marple's brow lifted slightly. "Not Mrs. Bream?" Margaret looked down. "I don't know." When Miss Marple returned home, she sat for a long time with her hands folded. She thought of linen that burned but left no smoke, of Margaret's fear, of Hester's tears, and of something tearing, cloth, pages, a letter. No, not just something burning. Someone had been trying to destroy something that could not be allowed to exist. And someone else, someone in that house, was very much afraid it had not been destroyed completely. That evening, Miss Marple took out her garden scissors and fussed around her rose beds with apparent dedication, though her mind was not on thorns or blooms. Something had been burned at the vicarage, something worth hiding, and yet not fully hidden, for fear lingered in the house. Margaret Finch's fearful glance, Hester Bream's swollen eyes, and Arnold Bream's sudden secrecy all pointed not to a fire's aftermath, but to a truth too fragile to endure light. The next day brought a quiet knock at Miss Marple's door just after breakfast. Her housemaid Edna answered and returned with a puzzled expression. "It's Mrs. Bream, miss. She says she'd like a word." Miss Marple set down her marmalade toast. "Do show her in." Hester entered in a pale lavender coat, a hat pulled low, her eyes still red-rimmed beneath. She did not sit when invited, but stood awkwardly near the fireplace, fingers working at her gloves. "I'm sorry to intrude, Miss Marple," she began, voice low. "I didn't know whom else to speak to." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Then you did quite right. Sometimes a quiet chat can help set the mind at ease. I've hardly slept," Hester said. "Not since the fire. Arnold insists it was nothing, an accident, but I keep replaying it all in my head. The way he looked, the smell, the silence afterward." Miss Marple's tone was mild. "I understand Margaret Finch had been by not long before." That clearly startled Hester, who nodded slowly. "Yes, I'd asked her to bring the hymnals. She's usually very prompt, but that day she lingered. Arnold came in from the study and saw her there, and something in him just changed. He told her to go, not unkindly, but very firmly. And then I heard them arguing, quietly. After she left, Arnold went back into the study. A few minutes later, there was smoke, just a little, but a dreadful smell. I rushed in, and he was standing over the fireplace, burning something. He claimed it was scraps, old papers. Said they weren't important." Her eyes flicked up. "But he looked frightened." "Arnold's never frightened." "Did you see what it was?" Miss Marple asked delicately. "No, only that it was thick paper, and it had red on it. Not printed, I think, like sealing wax. He wouldn't let me near it." Miss Marple gave a slow nod. "You've done the right thing, my dear. May I ask, did you notice anything missing after the fire? Any book, letter, or document?" Hester hesitated, then nodded once more. "Yes. There was a drawer in his desk, always locked. After that day it was open and empty." Miss Marple stood and gently placed a hand on Hester's arm. "Would you allow me to visit the vicarage, just for a moment? I believe a fresh pair of eyes might help dispel lingering worry." The younger woman didn't respond immediately, but then she gave a sharp nod as though bolstered by a decision. "Come this afternoon," she said. "Arnold will be in the vestry." Later, Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage under the pretense of donating some old prayer books. Hester met her at the door and quickly led her into the parlor. The room smelled faintly of ashes, though the hearth was empty now. Miss Marple's eyes drifted to the blackened edge of the rug and a subtle mark along the base of the wall. Scorching, barely visible unless one knew to look. Hester stood by the study door. "I'll wait here." "Please be quick." Miss Marple stepped inside. The study was dark-paneled, lined with modest theological texts and immaculately kept. The desk, though, drew her attention. A drawer hung open, the lock's metal catch twisted, no longer functional. Within it, only the faintest ghost of a stain remained, a circle of crimson wax that had pressed through parchment. She knelt and examined the drawer more closely, then lifted her handkerchief to wipe along the bottom panel. A thin sliver of paper had wedged itself between the wood and the inner lip. She teased it free. Only one line was visible, its ink smudged but legible. "I've watched, and I know what you are." Miss Marple folded the fragment away into her sleeve. She rose, gave the room a final glance, and stepped out. "Thank you, my dear," she said gently. "I believe you have more answers than you realize." When Miss Marple reached her cottage once more, she immediately wrote a note summoning Inspector Crayborn to tea. The man arrived promptly the following morning, a courteous, practical fellow with thinning hair and an expression that rarely wavered from mild suspicion. "I confess," he said over the first cup of tea, "I was surprised to hear from you, Miss Marple. There's been no report filed regarding any wrongdoing." "And yet," Miss Marple said calmly, "I believe something quite serious may have happened, or is about to happen, unless we are very careful." She handed him the fragment. He studied it, eyebrows lifting. "This was recovered from the vicarage?" "Yes, from a drawer. Arnold Bream claimed held nothing of importance, though it was locked and the lock itself destroyed. The rest of the note, I fear, was burned. The inspector frowned. Sounds like blackmail. I rather think it was. Or at the very least a threat. Whether grounded in truth or manipulation remains to be seen. He set the slip down. And your theory? I believe someone discovered, or believes they discovered, something shameful about the vicar, possibly connected to Margaret Finch. Possibly not. Either way, they used that knowledge to apply pressure, Crayborn considered. And he burned the letter in a panic. But if he was innocent, he might have done so anyway to protect his wife. Or his reputation. Or perhaps because the accusation struck too close to something true. The inspector stood. I'll have a discreet word with Margaret Finch. And I'll speak to the vicar. But when he arrived at the Finch bakery, he found the upstairs room empty. Margaret Finch was gone. No one had seen her leave, and none of her belongings were missing, save a small travel case and her coat. Her mother, bewildered and trembling, claimed she had heard nothing. Miss Marple received the news from the inspector at dusk. She sat in her high-backed chair, her knitting motionless in her lap. "So the girl has fled," she murmured. "That alters things. She must believe she's in danger, or fears causing it." Crayborn rubbed his jaw. "We'll put out a quiet inquiry. I don't want to startle the village unless absolutely necessary." But even as he left, Miss Marple's gaze remained distant. Margaret had not fled randomly. The girl was terrified, yes, but also deliberate. She was hiding something, or perhaps protecting someone. The letter had been destroyed. But a secret remained, and secrets, Miss Marple knew too well, had a curious way of calling attention to themselves. And soon, someone else in East Gossington would take desperate steps to ensure it never saw the light of day. The morning after Margaret Finch's sudden disappearance brought with it a somber hush over East Gossington. The village seemed to hold its breath, as if reluctant to disturb the fragile peace that had already been shattered by the fire at the vicarage, and now by the absence of the young woman whose quiet presence had, until recently, been a steady part of their days. Miss Marple, meanwhile, was up early, her mind restless as she pondered the threads of the mystery that now stretched before her like an intricate tapestry. She dressed with deliberate care, settling on a soft blue dress that matched the calm she wished to project, but belied the tension beneath. After a simple breakfast, she walked out with a measured pace toward the bakery, the heart of the village, where whispers and speculation now brewed like the morning's first tea. The bakery was quieter than usual. Mrs. Finch, Margaret's mother, sat by the window clutching a handkerchief with trembling hands. Her eyes were red, and her lips pressed into a thin line, as if keeping a painful secret locked within. Miss Marple approached gently. "Mrs. Finch," she said softly, "I'm so sorry to hear about Margaret." "I can only imagine how difficult this must be." Mrs. Finch looked up, her expression weary but resolute. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I don't know what to think. Margaret never mentioned feeling afraid, at least not to me. She said only that she had a letter she needed to confront, but when I asked about it, she changed the subject." Miss Marple nodded, understanding the delicate nature of such a confession. Sometimes young people carry burdens they feel too heavy to share. Did she say where she might have gone? No, nothing. Her bed was made, her things untouched, except for a small case she packed hastily. She paused. She did say, though, that she was expecting a visitor. A Mr. Collingwood, someone she met at church. Miss Marple's eyebrows twitched with interest. "Mr. Collingwood. I believe I've heard that name before. A new arrival to the parish, is he not?" "Yes, just a few months ago. Quiet man, kept mostly to himself, though always polite. Margaret mentioned he had some connection to her father's past business affairs, but she never elaborated. Thank you, Mrs. Finch. I will pay Mr. Collingwood a visit." As Miss Marple walked away, Mrs. Finch's shoulders sagged with the weight of uncertainty. The village, once a safe cocoon of familiar faces and predictable routines, now harbored shadows that lengthened with each passing hour. Miss Marple's first stop was the rectory, where Inspector Crayborn awaited her arrival. He looked up from his notes with a guarded smile. "Back so soon, Miss Marple. What have you learned?" "I have a lead," she said quietly. Margaret mentioned a Mr. Collingwood, someone connected to her family's past. It seems this man was expected to visit her shortly before she vanished. Crayborn frowned, flipping through his papers. "No mention of him in our records. But I'll look into it. Anything else?" Miss Marple hesitated, then added, "There was a letter, partially burned, found in the vicar's desk drawer." The fragment read, "I have watched, and I know what you are." The inspector's eyes narrowed. A threatening note, then. That changes things. It does. And Margaret's disappearance suggests she either feared exposure or was trying to protect someone. They exchanged a glance, heavy with unspoken concerns. Later, Miss Marple made her way to the small cottage at the edge of the village, where Mr. Collingwood was said to reside. The house was modest, with climbing ivy and a neat garden tended with care. She knocked, gently, and after a moment the door opened to reveal a man of medium height, with keen grey eyes and a reserved demeanour. "Mr. Collingwood?" "I'm Miss Marple," she introduced herself, stepping inside at his invitation. The interior was neat, filled with books and papers arranged in careful order. "Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure?" he asked, his tone polite but cautious. "I'm investigating the disappearance of Margaret Finch. I understand you were expected to visit her." He nodded slowly. "Yes, Margaret and I share some history, though distant. My connection is to her late father's business dealings, which were not always straightforward. I'd hoped to speak with her about a matter that could clear some lingering questions." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her glasses. "And what questions might those be?" "Financial discrepancies, mostly," he admitted. "Some accounts that were never fully explained. Margaret seemed eager to set things right, though I believe she feared what might come to light." Miss Marple studied him for a moment. "Did she confide in you directly? Or was this more of a professional matter?" "More professional, but with a personal edge." She wanted to protect her family's name, yet also sought the truth. Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door. Mr. Collingwood's expression tightened as he excused himself. Miss Marple listened carefully as a voice called out, "Mr. Collingwood, a word, please." From the vicar, he stepped outside, and Miss Marple was left alone with her thoughts. She moved to the window, gazing out as shadows lengthened across the garden. The village held its secrets tightly, but it was clear the walls were beginning to crack. Returning to the vicarage later that day, Miss Marple found Arnold Bream alone in the study, pacing with a restless energy. His eyes flickered nervously as she entered. "Mr. Bream," she began gently, "I trust you are managing after the fire." He gave a forced smile. "As well as can be expected, Miss Marple. It's all rather upsetting." "Indeed. May I ask about the letter fragment I mentioned? Who do you believe sent it?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know. Whoever it was wanted to unsettle me. Perhaps to drive me to do something rash." Miss Marple's gaze was steady. "And have you any idea what truth they might seek to expose?" His face hardened. "No, and I intend to keep it that way." As the evening settled over East Gossington, Miss Marple walked home beneath a sky growing dusky and uncertain. Each step seemed to echo the quiet turmoil that now gripped the village, the stolen letters, the frightened girl, the hidden histories. The clues, small and scattered, were beginning to weave a pattern, but what remained elusive was the heart of the secret, and the reason someone would risk so much to keep it buried. Inside her cozy cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair, the day's discoveries turning over in her mind. She knew the next move would come soon, whether from the frightened Margaret Finch, the guarded vicar, or the enigmatic Mr. Collingwood. And when it did, it would bring her closer to unraveling a mystery where the fire had gone out without smoke, but its consequences still burned fiercely beneath the surface. The following morning dawned cool and overcast, the sky a pale canvas waiting for the brushstrokes of a day yet to unfold. Miss Marple, as was her custom, began with a slow walk through the village, observing the subtle changes in the rhythm of East Gossington since Margaret Finch's disappearance and the unsettling fire at the vicarage. The usually bright and bustling streets now seemed quieter, the villagers subdued yet restless, as if the undercurrent of anxiety had woven itself into the fabric of everyday life. Her first visit was to the Finch household. Mrs. Finch greeted her at the door, her face pale but steady, bearing the resolve of a mother determined to hold her family together. "Miss Marple," she said with a fragile smile, "I'm grateful you came." "Mrs. Finch, I wanted to check if there was anything new you might recall about Margaret's plans. Sometimes the smallest detail can be the key we've overlooked." Mrs. Finch nodded, ushering Miss Marple inside to the parlor where the faint scent of lavender lingered. Margaret had kept a small notebook she called her Thoughts and Musings. She never let me see it, but last night, in the confusion, I found it tucked beneath her pillow. Miss Marple's eyes lit with quiet anticipation. "May I?" The notebook was delicate, bound in faded leather. Opening it carefully, Miss Marple found scattered notes written in Margaret's neat hand. Most were innocuous musings about village life and the changing seasons, but then her finger paused on a particular entry. "I must confront the past before it consumes the future. There is more to father's affairs than anyone suspects. Mr. Collingwood's warnings cannot be ignored. The vicar's words linger in my mind. I have watched, and I know what you are. But who is watching whom?" Miss Marple's brows furrowed slightly. The letter fragment and Margaret's cryptic notebook suggested layers of secrets twisting beyond what the villagers had yet realized. "Mrs. Finch, did Margaret ever mention feeling threatened by the vicar or anyone else in the parish?" Miss Marple asked gently. "No, not directly. But she did confide once that the vicar's kindness sometimes felt like a shadow, always present, never quite light." With a careful nod, Miss Marple closed the notebook. "Thank you, Mrs. Finch. This helps greatly." Leaving the Finch home, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted toward the vicar, Arnold Bream. His duel, nature, both comforting and unsettling, was now a clearer piece of the puzzle. She decided her next step would be to revisit the rectory, to observe the vicar in a different light, away from the strain of the immediate crisis. As she approached the rectory again, she noticed the vicar's car parked beside the driveway, a detail that suggested he had not yet left for his usual morning rounds. Miss Marple's knock was answered promptly by Mrs. Bream, the vicar's wife, who welcomed her with a reserved smile. "Miss Marple, it's good to see you again. My husband is in his study if you wish to speak with him." Miss Marple stepped inside, noting the warm, tidy interiors that contrasted with the dark rumours now swirling outside these walls. Arnold Bream was seated by the window, his fingers steepled as he regarded the garden with a distant look. "Vicar," Miss Marple began, "may I ask how you have been since the fire?" "It must be a trying time." "Indeed," he replied, his voice calm but edged with fatigue. "But the work of the parish must go on, no matter the trials." Miss Marple chose her words carefully. "I have been reflecting on the letter found among your papers, the one that warned, 'I have watched and I know what you are.' Do you have any idea who might have sent it?" Arnold Bream's eyes darkened for a moment before he masked it with a serene smile. "It was an attempt to unsettle me, surely." I am not naive enough to believe all in the village holds me in unquestioning trust, but I cannot say who would seek to threaten me in such a way. Does the phrase, "I have watched and I know what you are," resonate with any incident from your past? The vicar's smile tightened. Sometimes the past has a way of following us, whether we acknowledge it or not. But I intend to keep the past where it belongs, in the past. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened, sensing there was more beneath his measured words. Before she could inquire further, a soft knock came from the adjoining room. Mrs. Bream entered, carrying a tray with tea and biscuits. "Arnold, you promised to meet the church committee this afternoon," she reminded him gently. He sighed. "Of course." "Thank you, my dear." "Miss Marple, I appreciate your concern. Please, enjoy the tea." They exchanged polite farewells, but Miss Marple's mind was alight with questions. The vicar's evasiveness only deepened the mystery. Leaving the rectory, she wandered toward the village green where a few familiar faces gathered near the notice board. The air was thick with whispered gossip. Mrs. Pennyworth and Mr. Hargrove, longtime villagers, debated animatedly. "I tell you, the whole thing smells of something darker than mere accident," Mrs. Pennyworth declared. "That fire was no accident, and now Margaret disappears." "It's as if the village itself is hiding something foul," Mr. Hargrove shook his head. "You're jumping to conclusions, Elsie." "It's just a tragic string of bad luck," Miss Marple stepped forward, offering a gentle smile. "Bad luck? Or something more? Often it's the small details that reveal the truth." The villagers turned to her, curiosity mingling with the underlying tension. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Pennyworth said with a sigh, "do you really think there's something to uncover beyond what we see?" "Human nature is rarely simple, Mrs. Pennyworth," Miss Marple replied softly. "Sometimes what appears to be chance is the result of carefully hidden motives." As the afternoon progressed, Miss Marple's footsteps led her to the churchyard. Among the ancient tombstones, she found herself drawn to a weathered memorial bearing the name Finch. The inscription spoke of a man whose life was marked by both success and controversy. Charles Finch, Margaret's late father. She traced her fingers lightly over the engraving, contemplating the man whose shadow still loomed over the village and his family. It seemed clear that Charles Finch's past held keys to the present troubles, though exactly which keys remained elusive. Nearby, she noticed a figure approaching. The village doctor, Dr. Hayward, whose discreet presence often accompanied moments of crisis. He greeted her with a nod. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hear the village is restless. Have you any new insights?" "I believe the unrest stems from secrets long buried," she replied. "Mr. Finch's affairs seem to connect several threads. Financial, personal, and perhaps even spiritual." Dr. Hayward's expression darkened. "There have been whispers. Some say Charles Finch was involved in dealings that some would kill to keep quiet." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And the vicar? Has he ever spoken of Mr. Finch's past?" The doctor hesitated. "Only in passing. Arnold Bream is a man who prefers to keep his confidences close, but I have heard murmurs that his relationship with the Finch family was complicated." "Complicated how?" Miss Marple pressed. "Let's just say not everyone in East Gossington trusts the vicar's intentions." As the sky deepened to a soft grey, Miss Marple felt the weight of these revelations pressing closer. The village was a tapestry of intertwining lives, each thread fraught with unspoken tensions and hidden truths. Her thoughts returned to Margaret Finch, brave yet burdened by knowledge too dangerous to share openly. The fire, the threatening letter, the disappearance, all parts of a puzzle that would not yield easily. But Miss Marple was patient. She knew that in the quiet moments between the noise of suspicion and fear, the truth would whisper its secrets, and when it did, she would be ready to listen. Miss Marple's steps took her from the solemn churchyard back toward the heart of East Gossington, where the lingering warmth of the afternoon sun was beginning to wane beneath the gathering clouds. The village felt heavier now, as if every stone and shuttered window bore silent witness to the secrets pressing just beneath the surface. The deeper Miss Marple delved, the more she realized that everyone here was living with a carefully constructed facade, and behind those facades, old wounds throbbed unseen. Her next destination was the village pub, the Crown's Rest, a place that served as the informal gathering spot for news, gossip, and the occasional revelation disguised as casual conversation. As she entered, a murmur of voices hushed briefly before resuming their low hum. At the far corner, she spotted Mr. George Hargrove and Mrs. Elsie Pennyworth engaged in animated discussion, their brows furrowed and expressions tense. Nearby sat Thomas Collingwood, whose earlier letter had stirred so much speculation. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." Thomas greeted her with a tight smile, his eyes sharp and calculating. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything too delicate." "Not at all," she replied, settling into a chair beside him. "In fact, I was hoping to speak with you about your correspondence with the vicar." Thomas's gaze flickered to the darkening sky outside the window. It was a warning, of course. The vicar is not as saintly as he presents himself. There are things in his past that would surprise you. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "And what might those be?" He hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. Rumors of financial impropriety, connections to unsavory characters, and perhaps more personal, disturbing matters. The mention of financial matters caused Miss Marple to recall the cryptic reference in Margaret Finch's notebook about father's affairs. It seemed the vicar's connection to the Finch family extended beyond spiritual guidance. "Did Margaret ever speak to you about the Finch family's troubles?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Thomas shook his head. "She was cautious, fearful even. I think she sensed she was walking a dangerous line. That letter she received, 'I have watched and I know what you are,' was meant to intimidate. But I suspect it came from someone closer than she realized." The conversation was interrupted by the entrance of Mr. Samuel Pickering, the village grocer, whose usually jovial demeanor was now clouded by unease. He approached Miss Marple with a hurried whisper. "Miss Marple, have you heard? There's been another incident at the vicarage. Something found in the garden." Curious, she rose and followed him outside, the afternoon air turning chilly as a brisk wind stirred the fallen leaves. In the vicarage garden, a small crowd had gathered around a patch of upturned earth. The local constable was examining a tarnished locket half buried in the soil. Miss Marple knelt to inspect the object. It was an old-fashioned silver locket, worn with age, engraved with delicate initials. M.F. She glanced up at the crowd, eyes settling, on Mrs. Bream, who stood pale and rigid nearby. "Where was this found?" Miss Marple inquired. "Just beneath the old rose bush," the constable replied. "It looks like it's been buried for some time." Mrs. Bream's lips trembled. "That belonged to Margaret," she said softly. "She always wore it." Miss Marple's mind raced. The locket, hidden in the vicarage garden, was a tangible link between Margaret and Arnold Bream's household. But why was it buried there? Was it a message, a clue, or a desperate act to conceal something? "Did Margaret ever visit the garden often?" she asked Mrs. Bream. "Sometimes," Mrs. Bream admitted. "She found it peaceful here. But since Father Finch's death, she was uneasy about coming here alone." The pieces began to fit together more tightly. Margaret's disappearance, the threatening letter, the fire, each a thread woven into the complex tapestry of relationships centered on the Finch family and the vicar. Returning to the village centre, Miss Marple sought out Inspector Harris to share the discovery. The inspector listened thoughtfully, the usual brisk certainty tempered by the weight of recent events. "This locket might just be the breakthrough we need," he said. If Margaret left it here deliberately, she was trying to tell us something. Miss Marple nodded. But what message? And to whom? Their speculation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Hayward, who brought troubling news. Miss Marple, Inspector, there's been an update from the hospital. The man found near the vicarage, the one with the burn wounds, has regained consciousness. The inspector's eyes brightened with renewed hope. We must speak with him at once. At the hospital, they found Mr. Edward Mills, a local handyman whose injuries were severe but stable. His memory was fragmented, but certain details emerged: a heated argument with an unknown figure, a warning shouted before the fire broke out, and the urgent plea to protect Margaret Finch. He mentioned a secret, something about the vicar, Dr. Hayward explained, but he's too weak to say more. Miss Marple sat quietly beside the bed, observing the faint flicker of fear in Edward's eyes. She reached out gently. Edward, do you remember who you were arguing with? Who wanted to harm Margaret? He shook his head slowly, frustration evident. No, just shadows. But I know someone in the village is hiding the truth. Leaving the hospital, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the web of village secrets, lies, and half-truths. The vicar's evasiveness, Margaret's notebook, the hidden locket, and now Edward's cryptic memories all pointed toward a hidden danger, cloaked in familiar faces. Back in her cottage, as evening deepened and the first stars appeared, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her mind piecing together the fragments. The village was restless, and the danger had not yet passed. Somewhere within the tangled web of East Gossington's social life lurked the answer. But the final unraveling was still to come, and Miss Marple, with her keen eye and steady patience, was prepared to see it through. The following morning dawned cool and grey, a thin veil of mist curling among the trees as East Gossington stirred awake under the muted light. Miss Marple set out early, her pace unhurried but purposeful. The events of the past days had stirred the village into a restless tension, and the faint whisper of unease seemed to trail her as she walked past tidy gardens and shuttered windows. Yet beneath this veneer of calm, the currents of suspicion and fear churned steadily. Her first call was to the vicarage. The garden, where the locket had been found, now stood cordoned off with simple rope and hand-lettered notices, warning against disturbance. The vicar, Reverend Ernest Finch, was seated by the window in his study, a figure diminished but still retaining an air of subdued authority. His eyes, shadowed by recent grief and scrutiny, lifted as she entered. Miss Marple? He greeted her in a voice barely above a whisper. I'm grateful for your visit. These are difficult times for all of us. I can only imagine, Reverend, she said gently. May I ask, have you noticed anything unusual since your father's passing? Anything that might help us understand what Margaret was troubled by? Reverend Finch sighed, folding his hands tightly. There have been tensions, yes, between my father and certain villagers. Old grievances that were never fully aired. Margaret was aware of some. She feared that secrets buried long ago might come to light, upsetting the fragile peace. Did she ever confide in you directly? Miss Marple probed. Only in fragments. She spoke of feeling watched, threatened, though she never named names. She was particularly worried about the legacy of the Finch family's dealings. Financial entanglements, disputes over property, matters best left alone, perhaps. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, recalling Thomas Collingwood's mention of financial impropriety. Did your father have any enemies who might wish to harm the family? The vicar's gaze darkened. There was one, a man named Charles Avery. Once a close friend, now estranged. Their falling out was bitter, tied to accusations of betrayal and lost fortunes. Avery left the village years ago, but the wounds remain. That name struck a chord with Miss Marple. She had heard whispers of Charles Avery, a man once respected, now a ghost in East Gossington's collective memory. The possibility that he might return, or that his influence still lingered, opened new avenues to explore. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple's steps led her toward the modest cottage where Margaret Finch had lived. It was a neat home, carefully maintained, yet betraying signs of recent turmoil. The garden was overgrown in places, and the front door bore the faintest scratch marks. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lavender and old paper. Margaret's belongings remained, untouched since her disappearance. A small writing desk, a collection of well-worn books, and a faded photograph of Margaret with her father, smiling in happier days. As Miss Marple examined the desk, her eye caught a scrap of paper pinned beneath a blotter. It was a fragment of a letter, the ink blurred, but the words, "Meet me at dusk," clearly visible. The signature was missing, but the tone was urgent, imploring secrecy. This clandestine note suggested Margaret was involved in something she deemed dangerous enough to warrant covert meetings. Miss Marple's mind raced. Was this connected to the threatening letter, the fire, or perhaps to Charles Avery's shadow? Her musings were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. It was Mrs. Elsie Pennyworth, the village's informal chronicler and Miss Marple's reliable informant. "I thought you might be here," Elsie said, stepping inside with a bundle of newspapers under her arm. "There's been talk, quite the stir, about a stranger seen near the village outskirts yesterday. Tall, dark coat and a wary glance. Folks are saying it might be Charles Avery come back to settle old scores." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled with the spark of renewed purpose. "Thank you, Elsie. That is very helpful." Together, they pored over the papers, which bore no official mention of Avery, but village gossip was often more telling than headlines. A pattern began to emerge, an old feud rekindled, a shadow from the past returning just as the present crisis deepened. Miss Marple decided it was time to visit the village inn, the Swan's Rest, where travelers and locals mingled and where Avery might have been seen. The innkeeper, Mrs. Hargrave, was a stout woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense manner. When Miss Marple asked about the stranger, her expression grew guarded. "Yes, I saw him," Mrs. Hargrave said quietly. "Came in last night, asked about the vicar. Didn't give his name, but he looked like a man with unfinished business." Stayed only a short while before slipping back into the mist, Miss Marple considered this carefully. A man seeking the vicar, concealed in mystery, arriving just as turmoil gripped the village. It was hardly coincidental. She asked Mrs. Hargrave if she could describe the man more fully. "He had a scar just above his left eyebrow," the innkeeper recalled, "and a cold, calculating air. Not the sort you forget easily. That detail was crucial." Miss Marple remembered Edward Mills's fragmented memories, the heated argument, the warning shouted before the fire. Could this stranger be the link connecting the threats, the fire, and Margaret's disappearance? As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple felt the weight of the village's secrets pressing closer. Every person, every whispered word, seemed to ripple with hidden meanings. The Finch family's troubles were not isolated. They were entwined with East Gossington's very history. Her thoughts turned to the villagers she had met, the proud yet fearful Mrs. Bream, the elusive Thomas Collingwood, the inscrutable Reverend Finch, and now this mysterious man. Each held pieces of the puzzle, fragments that must fit together to reveal the truth. But there was one more place to visit before the day ended. The old mill on the edge of the village, where Margaret was said to have gone to think, away from prying eyes. If anyone had followed her there, it might shed light on the final hours before she vanished. The mill stood silent, its once bustling machinery stilled by time. Miss Marple walked carefully among the ruins, her eyes scanning for any sign overlooked. Beneath a pile of discarded tools, she spotted a folded piece of cloth, silken and stained with something dark. Gently unfolding it, she found a torn fragment of a letter, its edges singed as if narrowly escaping the fire. The words were hurried, almost frantic, "Must protect the truth no matter the cost." Trust no one. Miss Marple's heart quickened. This was no ordinary disappearance or accident. It was a desperate struggle to keep a secret safe, a secret worth killing for. As twilight descended, she realized that the fire had been a warning, the locket a message, the threats a veil, hiding something far more sinister. East Gossington's peaceful exterior was a fragile mask over a web of deceit and danger. Her next steps would require the patience and subtlety she was known for. The village held its breath, waiting for the truth to emerge from the shadows, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it, no matter where it led. The early morning fog clung stubbornly to the lanes of East Gossington as Miss Marple set out again, the chill in the air hardly enough to deter the sharpness of her resolve. The fragments she had uncovered, the torn letter, the elusive stranger, the locket, were threads woven into a tapestry of mystery more tangled than any she had encountered in recent memory. Each led inevitably to the next, but the whole picture remained frustratingly out of reach. Yet, as always, it was the smallest details, the overlooked gestures and the unspoken glances, that promised to reveal the truth. Her first visit was to the vicarage once more. Reverend Finch, though reserved, had been cooperative, but Miss Marple sensed that his grief weighed heavily upon him, perhaps shielding some secret beneath his sorrow. She hoped that with time the barriers would fall and more would come to light. She found him in his study, the room still somber despite the growing light outside. "Good morning, Reverend," she said softly. "May I trouble you for a moment?" He looked up, a faint smile of recognition and gratitude flickering across his weary face. "Of course, Miss Marple. How can I assist you? I have been reflecting on what you told me about the past grievances, particularly your mention of Charles Avery. You said he left the village years ago, but there are reports he may have returned. Is there anything else you can share about your father's relationship with him? Any quarrels that might have escalated beyond mere words?" The Reverend's fingers tightened around his cup, his gaze distant. "My father and Charles were once close friends, as I said, but the friendship soured over money and trust. Charles invested heavily in my father's ventures, only to accuse him later of deception. The resulting legal battles drained the family's resources and reputation. After Charles left, there was bitterness on both sides. My father tried to bury the past, but some wounds never heal." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. "Did Margaret ever mention whether she believed Charles Avery might return seeking retribution?" "Only once," the Reverend admitted. "She said she feared old debts and grudges might resurface, endangering not just our family, but the village itself. She seemed convinced that some people were willing to go to great lengths to protect their interests." The conversation left Miss Marple with much to ponder. It was clear the roots of the conflict ran deep, intertwining personal and financial motives that could easily kindle deadly intent. But who among the villagers stood to gain most from such chaos? As she walked back through the village square, the slow awakening of East Gossington seemed at odds with the turmoil beneath its surface. At the post office, she stopped briefly to speak with Mrs. Bennet, a sprightly woman with a knack for gathering gossip. Mrs. Bennet was bustling about, sorting mail but always ready with a whisper of the latest village news. "Any new developments, dear?" Miss Marple inquired with a twinkle in her eye. Mrs. Bennet lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Well, you know, there's talk of a heated argument at the pub last night. Thomas Collingwood was seen leaving in a hurry, looking quite disturbed. Some say he was warned to stay away from certain matters." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. Thomas Collingwood, the architect with the tangled loyalties, had already been a subject of suspicion. If someone had threatened him, it could mean he held information someone desperately wanted, kept quiet. She decided to pay Collingwood a visit, hoping to observe his demeanor firsthand. His cottage was perched near the village edge, surrounded by a wild garden that seemed to reflect his turbulent thoughts. He opened the door, surprise flickering across his features before he masked it with a cautious smile. "Miss Marple," he greeted, I didn't expect to see you so soon. I heard you had an unsettling evening, she said gently. May I come in? He stepped aside, allowing her in. The interior was neat but sparsely decorated, revealing little beyond practicality. Collingwood poured tea with hands that trembled slightly. There are things you should know, he began, lowering his voice, about the Finch family, the debts, the grudges. Margaret was not just a bystander. She was involved in uncovering some truths, things that certain people would kill to keep buried. Who do you mean? Miss Marple asked softly. His eyes darted to the window, then back. I cannot say openly, but the name Charles Avery comes up again and again. He has allies here, people who still fear him. They warned me off, but I intend to see this through. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already piecing the fragments together. Collingwood's courage was admirable, but he was clearly vulnerable. Protecting him might be essential to unveiling the larger scheme. Later that afternoon, she visited the local inn to see Mrs. Hargrave once more. The inn was lively, filled with villagers and a few travellers, but beneath the convivial atmosphere lay a current of tension. Mrs. Hargrave was sweeping behind the bar when Miss Marple approached. "Any news of the stranger?" she asked. "Nothing concrete," Mrs. Hargrave replied, "but I did overhear something that might interest you. There's talk that the stranger has been seen meeting in secret with one of the village council members, someone with much to lose if the Finch family's secrets come to light." Miss Marple's brow furrowed. "Do you know who?" Mrs. Hargrave hesitated. "No, not for certain." "But it's someone often seen with Thomas Collingwood." The circle was tightening. Miss Marple realized that the tangled web of alliances and betrayals was wider than she had suspected. The true puppet master behind the scenes was still hidden, manipulating the pieces carefully. As evening fell, she returned to her cottage, where the familiar comfort of home allowed her to reflect calmly. The clues pointed to a conspiracy rooted in past grievances, fueled by fear and greed. Margaret Finch had stumbled upon this dangerous truth, and the fire, the threats, the locket were all warnings, a desperate attempt to shield the secret. Miss Marple's keen mind began to formulate a plan. The next step was to draw out the puppet master, to unsettle the hidden figure and watch their reactions closely. She knew the power of subtlety, of a carefully placed question or a deliberate remark. Tomorrow she would visit the village council meeting, where tensions would be high and secrets likely to slip. There, she intended to observe the players in their natural environment, listening for the faintest hint of deception. The village of East Gossington was far from the quiet idyll it appeared to be. Beneath its peaceful surface, currents of fear and ambition swirled dangerously. Miss Marple was certain the answers lay just beneath the carefully maintained facade, and she was ready to uncover them, one delicate thread at a time. The morning mist was lifting as Miss Marple made her way to the village hall, its modest facade belying the significance of the gathering within. The council meeting was scheduled to discuss several mundane issues, road repairs, the upcoming fete, but Miss Marple knew better. Beneath these routine matters simmered tensions freshly stirred by recent events. The village's unease, like the fog, was thick and persistent, and today it would be laid bare. Inside, the hall was crowded, villagers settling into their familiar seats with varying degrees of apprehension. At the head of the room sat the chairman, Mr. Lionel Carr, his usually confident expression shadowed by concern. Beside him were other council members, including the elusive figure who had drawn Miss Marple's suspicion in the inn. Mrs. Edith Pritchard, known for her keen sense of order and influence over village affairs. Miss Marple took her place quietly at the back, blending into the crowd. Her eyes scanned the room, noting the nervous glances exchanged, the tight grips on handrails, the occasional cough that seemed more effort than necessity. She knew that in such moments, true characters were revealed, not by their words but by their silences. in the way they avoided direct eye contact. The meeting began with the usual formalities, but it wasn't long before the conversation shifted. Mr. Carr cleared his throat and addressed the assembly. Before we move on to the scheduled business, I would like to remind everyone that these are difficult times for East Gossington. Recent events have shaken us all, and it is important that we remain united. A murmur of assent rippled through the room, but beneath it, an undercurrent of tension persisted. Mrs. Pritchard rose next, her voice calm but carrying a sharp edge. We must also remember that speculation and gossip do little to help. The police are conducting their investigation, and it would be wise for us all to respect their work and avoid unfounded accusations. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Mrs. Pritchard, noting how her eyes briefly flickered towards Thomas Collingwood, who sat stiffly in the corner, avoiding any engagement. It was as if the councilwoman were warning him through that glance alone. As the meeting proceeded, a young woman named Alice Morton stood to speak. She was a newcomer to East Gossington, but had quickly made a name for herself as an active member of the community. Her voice trembled slightly as she addressed the room. I understand the need for caution, but silence can also be dangerous. We cannot ignore that someone in this village may have committed a terrible act. If we turn a blind eye, who else will be at risk? Her words were met with mixed reactions. Some nodded in agreement, others shifted uneasily. Miss Marple noted that Alice's courage was genuine, but her naivety might expose her to unwelcome consequences. When the formal business resumed, Miss Marple observed that several villagers left early, their hurried departures a silent testimony to unease. Among those who remained, the whispered conversations grew more frequent, their tone increasingly speculative. After the meeting, Miss Marple lingered near the entrance, hoping to catch fragments of overheard conversations. She was not disappointed. Two women, standing just out of earshot, exchanged hurried words. I heard that Thomas was threatened again last night, one whispered, glancing over her shoulder, and that Mrs. Pritchard is trying to cover for him. It's all connected. I'm sure Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. Why would Mrs. Pritchard protect Collingwood, if indeed she did? What secrets bound them? Later that afternoon, Miss Marple arranged to meet with Thomas Collingwood once more. His hands still trembled, but his resolve seemed steadier. They're watching me closely, he admitted. Mrs. Pritchard has ways of making people feel uncomfortable. I fear for my safety, but I cannot abandon what I've discovered. Tell me everything you know, Miss Marple urged gently, settling into a chair in his modest sitting room. Collingwood took a deep breath. Margaret Finch uncovered some irregularities in the council's records, payments that didn't add up, contracts awarded without oversight. I believe these were orchestrated by Mrs. Pritchard and her allies to funnel money away from the village's coffers. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. And this, you believe, is the motive behind the threats and the attack? He nodded. Margaret threatened to expose them. The fire, the locket, the warning notes. They were meant to silence her and anyone who might follow. The pieces began to coalesce into a damning picture. Financial corruption, a determined whistleblower, and a ruthless circle desperate to maintain their grip on power. Yet Miss Marple sensed an even deeper layer, one that tied the present conspirators to the village's older wounds, to the grudges that Reverend Finch had alluded to. That evening, Miss Marple sat by the window of her cottage, the fire's flickering glow a small comfort against the darkening landscape. She reviewed her notes and the conversations she had gathered. The faces of the villagers, the wary eyes of Mrs. Pritchard, the nervous glances of Collingwood, the quiet sorrow of Reverend Finch, all formed a mosaic of motives and fears. Suddenly, a thought struck her. The torn letter, the locket, the elusive stranger, had they been misinterpreted as threats when perhaps they were messages of warning from Margaret herself? A cry for help disguised in symbols only a few would understand. Her mind returned to the mysterious visitor reported at the pub days earlier, a man seen speaking urgently with Mrs. Pritchard. What role did he play? Was he a new player or a ghost from the village's past? Miss Marple decided the next step was to confront Mrs. Pritchard directly, to watch her reactions under subtle pressure. But more than that, she would observe the interplay between her and the other council members, seeking fissures in their facade. The following morning, Miss Marple appeared at the village hall unannounced, requesting a private word with Mrs. Pritchard under the pretext of community concerns. The councilwoman received her with polite coolness, but Miss Marple noted the brief flash of unease in her eyes. They spoke in hushed tones in a small side room. Miss Marple began gently. "Mrs. Pritchard, East Gossington is a place where everyone's reputation matters deeply. I'm sure you understand that suspicion can be as damaging as any proven wrongdoing." Mrs. Pritchard's lips tightened. "I assure you, Miss Marple, I have nothing to hide. My loyalty has always been to this village." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Of course. Yet I've heard whispers, concerns about the council's finances and the recent turmoil following Mrs. Finch's death. These are troubling times, and sometimes even the best intentions can be clouded." For a moment, Mrs. Pritchard's composure cracked. A shadow crossed her face, but she quickly masked it. "People love to talk, Miss Marple, but gossip is not evidence." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed softly. "But sometimes gossip points us toward truths we might otherwise overlook." As they parted, Miss Marple sensed that the conversation had unsettled Mrs. Pritchard more than she let on. It was a small victory, but a telling one. The day wore on with little else of note until news reached Miss Marple late in the afternoon that Thomas Collingwood had been found unconscious near the river bank, apparently the victim of a fall. The villagers whispered of foul play, but no one knew for sure. Miss Marple hastened to the scene where Collingwood was being tended by the local doctor. Though bruised and shaken, he was expected to recover. "Someone is trying to stop him," Miss Marple murmured as she stood by his bedside, "but the truth will find its way no matter how deeply buried." The web was tightening, and the final act of this grim drama was fast approaching. Miss Marple's mind was alight with possibilities, her keen eyes watching, waiting for the moment when the true culprit would slip, unwittingly revealing the deadly secret that had ignited a fire without smoke in the heart of East Gossington. The crisp air of early evening settled over East Gossington as Miss Marple made her way from the river bank back toward the village. The fading light cast long shadows that seemed to mirror the darkening mood of the community. Thomas Collingwood's narrow escape had sent ripples through the villagers, but rather than quelling suspicion, it only seemed to deepen the unease. Whispers of a determined assailant prowling among them stirred a new wariness, as if everyone suddenly looked over their shoulder. Miss Marple's thoughts churned with the day's revelations and unanswered questions. The tangled web of alliances and grudges she'd begun to unravel was intricate and, she suspected, far from complete. The council's financial irregularities, Mrs. Pritchard's guarded demeanour, the shadowy visitor, and now Collingwood's near-fatal fall, all pointed to a calculated attempt to suppress the truth. Yet the question that lingered most heavily was why Margaret Finch had become the focal point of such malevolence. As she walked, Miss Marple's keen eyes caught sight of a figure standing near the entrance of the village church, a place that had grown sombre with the weight of recent events. Reverend Finch, pale and visibly drained, seemed lost in thought, clutching a small bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Miss Marple approached quietly, mindful of the grief etched in the man's posture. "Reverend," she said softly, "may I join you for a moment?" He looked up, startled but grateful for the company. "Miss Marple, of course, it is a comfort to see a familiar face." They stood together beneath the ancient oak, its leaves rustling faintly in the breeze. After a pause, Reverend Finch spoke, his voice low and trembling. "There is something I must confess. something I have held close, fearing it might cause more harm than good Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression encouraging. Margaret confided in me, not long before her death. She had discovered more than just financial misdeeds. There were threats, yes, but also something deeper, a secret tied to the village's past, one that some would kill to keep buried. The cloth in his hands rustled as he unfolded it, revealing an old photograph faded with age. It showed a group of villagers gathered around the same oak tree, but among them was a young woman whose face was strikingly familiar. "That is Eliza Marwood," Reverend Finch said, his gaze fixed on the image. "She was Margaret's grandmother." Miss Marple's mind raced. Eliza Marwood's name had surfaced in village lore, whispered about but never spoken openly. A scandal involving her decades ago had been quietly swept under the rug. The photograph suggested a connection between past and present that could explain the recent turmoil. "Do you think Mrs. Pritchard or others are trying to protect that secret?" Miss Marple asked. Reverend Finch nodded grimly. Yes, Eliza's story, if it came to light, could shatter reputations and change everything we thought we knew about East Gossington. Miss Marple studied the photograph once more, noting the peculiar position of one figure, a man whose face was partially obscured but whose stance suggested importance. This man, she mused aloud, might hold the key to the past and the present. As they spoke, a sudden commotion drew their attention. From the village hall, a group of villagers emerged hurriedly, their faces pale and voices tense. Among them was Mrs. Pritchard, her usual, composure faltering as she approached Reverend Finch and Miss Marple. "There's been another incident," she announced, breathless. "At the old mill. Someone has broken in and vandalized the place." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with the Reverend. The old mill had been abandoned for years, a relic of the village's industrious past, but it was also rumored to hold secrets related to Eliza Marwood's story. "Come," Miss Marple urged. "We must see what has been disturbed." The group followed her briskly to the mill, where the evening shadows deepened the sense of foreboding. The wooden doors hung askew, splintered from force. Inside, the once orderly space was ransacked. Tools scattered, papers torn, and signs of a struggle evident. Miss Marple's eyes fell upon a scrap of fabric caught on a nail, a pattern she recognized as belonging to one of the council members' attire. "This was no random act," she said quietly. "Someone sought something specific, perhaps evidence." As the villagers speculated, Miss Marple's gaze settled on a small, dust-covered box partially hidden beneath a broken bench. Carefully, she opened it to reveal a collection of letters and documents, their ink faded but still legible. One letter in particular caught her attention, a correspondence between Eliza Marwood and a man named Harold Clements, the village magistrate decades ago, whose name had not come up until now. The letter spoke of a clandestine meeting and a promise to protect a secret that could ruin families. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The threads connecting past and present were weaving a tapestry of deception, betrayal, and silence. As the villagers gathered around, she spoke firmly. "This secret has endured too long. It is the root of the fire that burned without smoke, the motive behind recent tragedies. But it will not remain hidden much longer." Mrs. Pritchard's face paled further, and for a fleeting moment Miss Marple caught a glimmer of something, fear, guilt, or perhaps something darker. Returning to her cottage later that night, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations. The true nature of the crime was coming into focus, yet the final pieces remained elusive. She understood that to uncover the whole truth, she would need to draw the suspects out, to see how they reacted under the gentle pressure of her subtle probing. In the days that followed, Miss Marple engaged in quiet conversations, each carefully crafted to elicit reactions without suspicion. She watched Mrs. Pritchard's composure falter under the weight of veiled questions. She observed Thomas Collingwood's resolve harden despite his injuries. and she noted how the villagers, who once whispered in shadows, now exchanged guarded glances in the open. Then came the moment Miss Marple had long anticipated. At the village fete, under the guise of casual socializing, she invited Mrs. Pritchard to join her for tea in the marquee. The crowd's hum softened around them as Miss Marple spoke with deliberate calm. "Mrs. Pritchard, you have served East Gossington faithfully, yet even the most loyal can be burdened by secrets too heavy to bear." Mrs. Pritchard's eyes flickered with unease, but she masked it with a practiced smile. "We all have our burdens, Miss Marple. But I assure you, mine are not as troubling as you suggest." Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "Sometimes the heaviest burdens are those we try hardest to hide. The past has a way of catching up with us, especially when lives are at stake." A bead of sweat formed at Mrs. Pritchard's temple, and her hand trembled slightly as she raised her teacup. Just then, a loud crash interrupted them. Across the marquee, a stack of crates toppled, spilling their contents and startling the crowd. In that fleeting distraction, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Pritchard's glance dart towards the edge of the gathering, where a figure slipped quietly away. The subtlety of the movement did not escape Miss Marple's keen eye. She understood that the game was nearly at its end, and soon the truth would emerge from the shadows. As the fete resumed, Miss Marple's mind was already weaving the final strands of the mystery, preparing to reveal the secret that had set the village aflame without a trace of smoke. The true story of East Gossington, with all its quiet betrayals and whispered sins, was about to be told. The air in East Gossington was crisp but carried a charged stillness as the village gathered once more in the hall, this time summoned by an invitation from Miss Marple herself. The usual hum of polite chatter was subdued, the weight of recent events pressing heavily on everyone's shoulders. The sense of anticipation was palpable. Everyone knew that tonight the tangled web of secrets would finally be laid bare. Miss Marple stood quietly near the front, her calm presence commanding attention without effort. She began with a measured tone. "Thank you all for coming. I've spent many days observing, listening, and piecing together the threads that have ensnared this village in fear and suspicion. Tonight, I will share what I have discovered." The room grew silent, all eyes fixed on her. East Gossington is a community bound by history, some proud, some painful. The fire that took Margaret Finch's life was no accident, and the threats to Thomas Collingwood were no mere coincidence. They were desperate acts to keep a secret hidden, a secret rooted in the past. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Margaret uncovered evidence of financial corruption within the council, orchestrated by none other than Mrs. Edith Pritchard and a small circle of allies. But the money was not the whole story. Long ago, Margaret's grandmother, Eliza Marwood, became entangled in a scandal involving Harold Clements, the village magistrate. Eliza was silenced, and her story was buried to protect powerful families. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and Mrs. Pritchard's face tightened. "The documents found in the old mill," Miss Marple continued, "revealed correspondence that proves Mrs. Pritchard's direct involvement in preserving that secret, even at the cost of innocent lives. Margaret threatened to expose them, and that is why she was murdered." A sharp intake of breath came from several corners of the room. Miss Marple's gaze fixed on Mrs. Pritchard, unwavering. Mrs. Pritchard's attempts to intimidate Thomas Collingwood were an effort to prevent him from following Margaret's path. The near-fatal attack at the riverbank was meant to silence him permanently. Mrs. Pritchard's composure finally cracked, her voice trembling as she stammered, "You have no proof." "This is slander." Miss Marple held up a folded piece of paper, the original letter from Harold Clements, carefully preserved by Margaret, detailing a promise to conceal Eliza Marwood's story in exchange for a silence. "Proof is in the details we choose to see," Miss Marple said gently. and in the evidence we uncover when we look beyond appearances. The village constable stepped forward to take Mrs. Pritchard into custody, the heavy burden of truth finally breaking through the carefully maintained facade. As the crowd dispersed, Thomas Collingwood approached Miss Marple, gratitude and relief evident in his weary eyes. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Without you, justice might never have been served." She smiled kindly. "Justice is never about speed, but about patience and careful listening. The truth will always find a way, even in the quietest of places." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over East Gossington. The village, scarred but resolute, could now begin the slow process of healing, its secrets no longer shackles but lessons in courage and truth. And as Miss Marple walked home through the fading light, she carried with her the satisfaction that justice, though often slow, had at last been done.